This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke. This week we are going to take a turn back to ancient Greece, and I want to talk about a very specific type of spirit from ancient Greek. I guess you could call it spirit lore or ghost lore. And I'm going to start by telling you the different types of ghost figures that there are in Greek myth and in Greek folk belief. And then I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to talk specifically about this one particular type, which I have covered to some degree. There's some overlap with things I have discussed in the episode that I did a couple years ago on the hanging virgins. That might be another place that I would reference after this if you would want to learn more about this topic. But this is going to be a specific type of ghost. Now, just to tell you, there's at least 4 different types of ghosts that are mentioned in ancient Greek writings. One is the biothanatoi, which is those dead by violence. Okay, those are battle dead and executed criminals. This is from Dan Ogden's book on ghosts and witchcraft in ancient Greece and Rome. And then there's the agamoi, which is those dead before marriage, of which this particular type of ghost I'm going to talk about is part of that class. Both male and female ghosts could be assigned this category, although female ones were regarded as particularly bitter insofar as marriage and motherhood, consequent upon it, were a woman's defining rights in antiquity. And then there's ataphoi, which is those who are unburied and don't go through burial rites, and so, of course, they cannot achieve rest. And the fourth type of ghost, or really restless dead is the correct term here, is the one we are talking about, is the Aorai or the Aorai, which is, we're going to talk specifically about the Aorai, which is the feminine version of this, and that is the untimely dead, those who cheated of their full stint of life, bitterly stayed back to haunt the land of the living, which they had been deprived. In theory, anyone who died of anything other than natural causes in old age could generate a ghost called an Aoros, though as a class they tended to be conceptualized primarily as the ghosts of children or babies. Okay. Now, the Aorai is probably a broader term, and we're going to use the feminine ending, not the OI, but the AI, because I want to make reference to the category of restless spirit that is related to women in particular. And in this definition, and I'm going to use Sarah Iles Johnston's definition here, her book is, and I've mentioned this one before, is called The Restless Dead, Encounters Between the Living and Dead in Ancient Greece, and this comes largely from chapter 5. Okay, her notes from, which is called Childless Mothers and Blighted Virgins. Okay. So, the way that Sarah Iles Johnston uses the term Aorai for the purposes of this book is to talk about women who die before they can bear children. And the Aorai, one of the features that they have is oftentimes they will steal children or kill children or other young women. Okay, it's not just babies, but it's other young women. And thus, as she says, stopping the reproductive process at both ends. So, you have this particular class of being that is a restless spirit, and the spirit is restless because they died before they got to fulfill their their destiny. At that time, it would have been viewed as their destiny or as their function in terms of becoming mothers and having children. It's important to recognize that in ancient Greece, the oikos, or household, was central. It was extremely, extremely important. And a lot of these myths can't be understood unless they're understood in terms of the family dynamic and the concept of family that they had at that time. Now, certainly in ancient Greece, before you get into societies that are perhaps more diversified, although you might still probably have seen this in Athens, in ancient Greece. The oikos, okay, if you think about it, is the time is before the time of having, perhaps a single king of a particular of a country or something like that. That's time you had more like tribal kings. You had chieftains, really, is what they were. For instance, when you read the Iliad, you have this catalog of ships. You have this. You have all of these generals coming from all over the place, and even though you see generals like Agamemnon or Odysseus or Diomedes coming forward as sort of prominent figures, really what they all are kings or tribal leaders of all of their particular domains. And that's the concept that we're working with here. So, in other words, you'd have the tribal king. The tribal king would marry a woman of his appropriate class and station, and her job was to bear children and to extend the family line. The other podcast that talks about this is the one on the Erinyes, or the Furies, because the Furies are a class, these three scary-looking women, their main function is to punish any transgressions that have to do with the family, particularly the killing of the mother, which is, because to kill the mother is to cut off the line of the family. I mean, not that the king couldn't marry again, but it changes the line. Things are different. So, so there's the idea of continuing the family line, that the household and having those children was very important. Why is it so important? Probably as a way of consolidating power, of extending the line, and perhaps also of a way of achieving immortality in a culture that does not believe in excuse me, that does not does not believe in this idea when you die that you're going to live some kind of immortal life among the gods in a place called heaven or anything like that. There wasn't that concept. As I have mentioned, everybody went to Hades, didn't matter who you were, what you did. Everyone had the same fate after death, even though some of the demigod heroes, got a little bit nicer deal after death. Yeah, most people, you were just dead, and that was it. Had nothing to do with morality, nothing to do with how you behaved in life. But you could undergo these particular kinds of punishment. Dying was one of these kinds of punishments, but again, like being pursued by the Erinyes might be a way that your any crime against the family might be punished. So in this case, okay, the Aorai actually have a lot of these traits. Have a lot of traits that that they're going to be interesting when we talk about what their similarities are. Now, sometimes they are referred to as child-killing demons. But as Sarah Iles Johnson explains, that's not really a great description. Because first of all, they're not all necessarily child-killing. Some of them just kill virgin women. Okay? And some of them, there's some, they're often described, the names that are given to certain ones that are described. We see the Lamia, we see Gelo, we see Marmo, or Marmaluke. And also the, I think I already said the Lamia. But those are the, Lamia, Gelo, and Marmo tend to be the main sort of archetypes of these restless dead. And so it's assumed that because they were not able to fulfill their feminine role in life, that they try to stop other women from doing that in death. And in fact, sometimes the Aorai are considered to be the companions of the Erinyes. The Erinyes are accompanied by these women, so who, in their loss, now go about seeking to punish other women. Although whether or not it is seen whether or not their presence with the Erinyes is really that of one of necessarily like a moral one, as if they're going to get women who transgress a certain rule. Although I imagine there were certain protections against these kinds of spirits. But their description is rather interesting. Now, first of all, I just want to mention that the Aorai, along with other what we think of now as demonic figures. See, the word demon's the other problem, because in ancient Greece, demon comes from daemon, which is really a messenger spirit. It's not an evil spirit per se. And in terms of our definition of the word demon, there's all different kinds of classes of being, according to our modern definition of that term, there's a lot of ancient Greek figures. The harpies, for example, which have, feet of the bird and, bird's wings and the head of a woman, might be classified as a type of demon. But they're really just different types of beings. And this idea of demons isn't really what's there. It's more of a sense of, as Sarah Iles Johnston says, there's successful life and there's successful death. You can have a successful life and do all the things that you're expected to do, and also it's expected that you're going to die in a certain state at a certain time, presumably of old age from natural causes, and on your death you're going to receive certain rites to make sure that you are properly buried and taken care of, and so therefore you are not, and that way you successfully cross into the underworld and you're over where you're supposed to be. This type of dead being is a problem because they didn't have a successful life. Okay, in this case, these are women who did not fulfill their role of being married and having children. Okay. And thus they don't have a successful death either. Because they're kind of stuck in this in-between place. And so that's why they are considered to be wandering spirits, and they wander with the Erinyes. If you go back to the Erinyes, Artemis, and also the Hanging Virgins. Those are 3 podcasts that I did that look at this subject. Because certainly there are a lot of rites to the virgin goddess Artemis. Because Artemis herself, now she's a goddess, of course, and she's an Olympian goddess, but she has a lot to do with cutting girls off before, in other words, she values virginity and chastity, so she gets very angry when these girls are married off and lose their virginity. So there has to be certain rites to appease Artemis so that she'll allow women to make that transition into adolescence. It's like you have to worry about Artemis plaguing you. But even without Artemis, now Artemis, that seemed to be sort of more of the natural danger of perhaps going into womanhood, perhaps giving birth for the first time, because giving birth, of course, is always a dangerous act. There's all of these critical moments in what they defined in the social female life in ancient Greece, and within the context of the oikos and the tribal household in particular. Okay, so let's talk about these Aorai. I'm going to talk about Lamia and Gello. Now, Walter Burkert, who's a very well-known historian of Greek religion, he tended to think that Lamia and Gello in particular were derived from Near Eastern demons called Lamashtu and Galu. Now, Lamashtu is defined as a female demon, I'm reading this from Wikipedia, a monster or malevolent goddess or demigoddess who menaced women during childbirth and, if possible, kidnapped their children while they were breastfeeding. She would gnaw on their bones and suck their blood, as well as being charged with a number of other evil deeds. She was a daughter of the sky god Anu. Okay. She's supposed to be a mythological hybrid with a hairy body, a lioness head, donkey's teeth and ears, long fingers and fingernails, and the feet of a bird with sharp talons. She is often shown standing or kneeling on a donkey, nursing a pig and a dog, and holding snakes. Okay. And that supposedly she has some resemblance to the Mesopotamian Lilith as well, in terms of the way she's described. So, as we see, this is, again, we have 2 elements here. We have not only someone who menaces women during childbirth, but also who not only kidnaps the children, but feeds on them. Okay, so there's a devouring element here. Now, Galu is, they were demons that hauled unfortunate victims off to the underworld. They were one of 7 devils, or the offspring of hell, of Babylonian theology, that could be appeased by sacrifice of the lamb at their altars. The goddess Inanna was pursued by Galu demons after being escorted from the underworld by Galatura and Curiata. In the descent, it stated that demons know no food, know no drink, eat no flower offering, drink no libation. They never enjoy the pleasures of marital embrace, never have any sweet children to kiss. They snatch the son from a man's knee. They make the bride leave the house of her father-in-law. Okay? So you can see why Burkert thinks there's a connection between these figures and these Aorai figures in Greek folklore and myth. However, Sarah Iles Johnston cautions against, as she puts it, just want to find the reference I have here. Yeah, cautions that you should not seek genealogy where there is only similarity. These cultures all did tend to resemble each other. We see this a lot. For example, we see a lot of Babylonian Sumerian belief trickling over into into the Jewish religion in particular. There's a lot more similarity there than people realize, not just in the flood myth. But that said, you don't know how much of it was originally there among the original people of Greece, what we think of now as Greece at the time. And she notes on page 170 of this, she says the Greeks tend to blame darker, mysterious things on, quote-unquote, Persians, Chaldeans, or Egyptians. So, so she is, so there's this tendency to say that something came from the outside. Certainly this is definitely true of the idea of certain magical practices, necromancy, Goetia, things like that, which were practiced in ancient Greece, were said to have come from Persia in particular. So, so they are, so there's a tendency to do that. But again, there's still a question there as to how much of that actually originated in the area itself. It seems to be, there seems to be something, again, we're talking about feminine forces that are archetypal, there's probably something embedded in human consciousness, collective human consciousness, even at that time, that deals with this idea. And to look a little bit more at that, we talked about the oikos of the family, but there's different forces that operate to destroy the family or destroy the expansion. If we think about the idea of expansion or expansiveness as having to do with bearing children and having your offspring throughout the world and, marrying in with other tribes and being related. So everybody gets to expand. We have more people and more interconnections. And the idea, of course, is that you go outside your own tribe and you expand by becoming involved with, intermarriage between tribes or between places. Okay? So the things then that we see, and we see this in Greek mythology quite often, are the forces of incest, okay, which is where it's kept within the family, which, as we know, is a biological no-no for a lot of reasons. But if we're just simply going to look at it in terms of this idea of the family as a concept, that is a way of limiting the family by not propagating, not bringing in other elements into the gene pool. And now you see it happen in Greeks among the gods, but when it happens among people, it's a very, very different situation. Whenever you have these kind of, for example, okay, what's an example of an incestuous child? Aegisthus, okay? When Agamemnon goes away to the Trojan War, and he ends up sacrificing his daughter Iphigenia to get favorable winds, he tricks Clytemnestra into bringing her, and then sacrifices her, or she's turned into a deer, or whatever, whatever version of the story. Nonetheless, Clytemnestra is really unhappy, and she wants to get revenge. There's also the idea within that same family, which is the House of Atreus, between Aegisthus and Thyestes. There was a fight over who was going to be the king, which of the brothers was going to get the kingship. And that's another whole long myth. But in any case, Aegisthus gains the kingship. Thyestes steals it from him first, but then it's given back to him. And he ends up inviting Thyestes to a banquet, but then he's murdered and cooked and killed Thyestes' son, which, by the way, that's another force, cannibalism, which we'll talk about. But Thyestes is told by the oracle of Apollo that the way to remedy this is to sleep with his own daughter and to produce a son, which is Aegisthus. Sorry, I've got... I'm mixing the names up here. It's Atreus and Thyestes, and then Thyestes' son with his daughter is called Aegisthus. And so Aegisthus goes off and while Agamemnon is away at war, and Agamemnon is the son of Atreus, okay? And while he's gone, Clytemnestra and Aegisthus get together, and they plot to kill Agamemnon, and Aegisthus is now going to take over. But when he does this, it leads to all kinds of corruption. It leads to Orestes killing his mother, and then the Furies pursuing him, but basically it essentially wipes out the line of Atreus, this whole way of behaving. So there's this idea of these incestuous and cannibalistic forces. Cannibalism is we often see it as, in Greek myth, as the father devouring the son. So again, there's a sense of, we're not going to let the family line continue. The father swallows the son in the way that Kronos swallowed his children. It's we're not going to allow the line to propagate. Similarly, the girl whose father locks her up in a tower somewhere and says, I'm not going to let any man marry you. Again, that's the feminine form of that almost that kind of devouring or repressing. Probably, Freud and so forth would probably relate it in some way to the Oedipal complex. But you have this idea. In all of these cases, you see what the common theme is. We're shutting the family off. We're not allowing for that expansion. In some way, we are corrupting the line, and then the line dies out. And that seems to be one of the worst things, because now it's like a true death. I mean, the body dies, that's a normal thing, and it happens, but your way of living on is through the family. So, just like in ancient Egypt, okay, the worst thing that could happen to you would not that you would be tortured in life after death, it's that demons would kill your soul and you wouldn't exist anymore. I mean, that was the worst thing. Not existing anymore is one of the worst things. So, the idea of these devouring beings was a very serious one to them. And the idea of a woman as having to fulfill the function of having children was considered to be of utmost importance. And for her not to do that, it's interesting because they say, it's almost, I want to read a little bit about that. I don't want to go into that, but there's that leads to a whole other can of worms, I guess you should say. In fact, I think I would like to read that to you from here. Let me just find my page. Okay. So Sarah Iles Johnston in this book is referring to the Greek Aorai, which she says that Geluds, Lamiae, Mormones, and other types of Aorai, which already kill babies and women, already moves them, of course, into the realm of the demonic. They are utterly inimical to the goals of a human society, and no good Greek woman would ever dream of imitating them. The etiological stories about some of the mythic crystallizations of these Aorai delimited the acceptable behavior of a Greek woman even more strictly, however. Zenobius tells Gello's story as follows. Fonder of children than Gello is a saying applied to women who died prematurely, to those who are fond of children, or those who are fond of children but ruin them by their upbringing. For Gello was a maiden, and because she died prematurely, the lesbians, meaning those from the Isle of Lesbos, say that her ghost haunts little children, and they also blame her for the deaths of those who die prematurely. Hesychius also reports that Gello died unmarried. Our second Aorai, Lamia, does manage to conceive and give birth, but she fails as a mother because her children die early in life, usually due to the wrath of Hera, which we talked about earlier in June, jealous of Lamia's relationship with her husband Zeus. Not normal, and also a very common theme. The fullest version of Lamia's story is given by Diodorus Siculus. And he says, at the base of this Libyan mountain was a large cave thickly covered with ivy and bryony, which according to myth had been born Lamia, a queen of surpassing beauty. But on account of the savagery of her heart, they said that the time had elapsed since it transformed her face into a bestial aspect. For when all of her children had been born to her had died, weighed down with misfortune and envying the happiness of other women and their children, she ordered that newborn babies be snatched away from their mother's arms and straightway slain. Wherefore, among us, even down to the present generation, the story of this woman remains among the children, and her name is the most terrifying to them. Other sources for the Lamia myth make it clear that in the standard tradition, Lamia herself killed the children, rather than commanding others to do so. The same story is told by the historian Durus of Samos, but with one important variation. Hera did not kill Lamia's children, but rather drove Lamia to kill them. This reminds us of Mormo's myth, for which we have one source only. Aristides speaks of Mormo, whose name frightens the children who hear it. They say she was a Corinthian woman who, one evening, purposefully ate her own children, then flew away. Forever thereafter, whenever mothers want to scare their children, they invoke Mormo. The similarity between Mormo and that of Lamia is noted by a scholaist, who elsewhere in the passage calls Mormo a type of Lamia. Now, a scholaist, as I mentioned, is one who annotates or footnotes another work. The scholaist to Theocritus' idol explains that the poet's reference to Mormo by saying that Mormo is just another name for Lamia, as is Gello, and then telling an abbreviated version of Diodorus' Libyan story. Equations of two or all of these creatures are found in ancient sources as well. Such equations should not surprise us. After all, in at least two cases, probably all three, the names, quote-unquote, are in reality adjectives that describe the ghost's qualities. Mormones are fearsome ones, and Lamiae are devourers. All these myths express the belief that the Aorai have their origin in mortal women who died before they'd born or successfully nurtured children. Thus they suggest it's not enough simply for women to hold back from the overtly inhuman act of killing children if they want to retain membership in the human race. They must also become successful mothers. Failure to do so is tantamount to murder. In other words, the myths deliver the same message that a Greek woman heard constantly from other sources. Her goal in life was to become a mother. Failure or refusal to meet this goal was virtually an attack against the most important structure by which human culture organized itself, the family. Okay. Loaded right there, right? Now, it's funny. I know in other podcasts I have talked about the tendency that people have to hate women who don't have children. I think I had mentioned probably more than once a New York Times article that referred to a survey about looking at, talking about different types of behaviors and ethics and so forth. And at least one of the things that came out of that survey is that more people felt that women who chose not to have children, in some cases, they ranked them as worse than serial killers. And we're sitting here going, why in the world would you do that? Like, why do you care whether a woman has children or not? And you wonder if psychologically it goes back to this unconscious archetype of the family and what the family is supposed to be. I think when we step outside that, we are now stepping into liminal territory, which, by the way, is one of the qualities of the Aorai. As she mentions, the Aorai are more frightening because they're liminal. They're on the boundary between two things, and they're both and neither at the same time. And to allow such a thing upsets the social and cultural norm. Now, I suppose you could see this in a society where, perhaps, again, this is a time maybe where a lot of women did die in childbirth, where childbirth was dangerous, certainly. So a lot of these things, so it became very, very, protecting the child and protecting birth became very, very important. Nowadays, in a world that's probably overpopulated, we don't care as much about whether or not somebody has a child. It's not necessary. It's no longer that the biology is not the destiny. We no longer look at women in that way. But this shows you how this particular folklore of the dark feminine grows up, at least on a social level, around the idea that, the sort of archetypal importance of the family as the key to immortality. So to willfully not have children is to basically willfully say, I'm looking to kill my family. That's the way it's viewed, which is a bizarre idea now. But that may be, we have to consider that may be where that idea originates. It no longer is valid in our modern culture, but you can see where this would, where this has become an issue at this particular period of time. So, and let's listen to some of the attributes of the Aorai. Okay, first of all, their traits as described by Sarah Iles Johnson in various places. I'm summarizing because I don't want to just sit here and read our chapter. But their traits are ugliness, hermaphroditism. So in other words, they're often described as having testicles or as having what they call a stick or a phallus. So they're female, but they've also got like male genitalia. Filthiness, they're usually dirty and they have dirty habits. They are shapeshifters, and in some cases they're described as part animal. either lupine or equine. So they're either associated with horses or they're associated with werewolves, okay, which is interesting, because werewolf mythology or iconography often has to do with, again, it's related to that cannibalism idea, the idea of cutting off the family. So this is like a female werewolf that may devour children. If we know that the original Lycos story that we talk about, Ovid talks about, is you have the king, Jupiter, king of the gods, comes to visit, and of course he's recognized and honored, but the one king decides, who's filled with hubris, thinks, I'm not going to honor you, and decides to test him by taking one of his prisoners, cooking and killing him, and feeding him at a banquet, and so Jupiter retaliates by turning them into wolves. So in other words, it's funny how the wolf in this becomes representative of that devouring and destructive nature of humans, the bestial one that would allow you to do that. You hear all the kind of these stories of cannibalism and the way humans can behave in ways that, there's plenty of horror movies about, cannibalistic beings. And I also think of the Scottish legend of the Sawney Bean family, which were a group of a family that lived in a cave and abducted passers-by and cooked and killed and ate them, And the way in which cannibalism potentially could drive one to madness, eating human flesh. In the same way it can happen, like if you think of mad cow disease, when they start feeding cows other cow parts, these are all things that are biologically, of course, they wouldn't have necessarily known that the way we do with the sciences at this time, but there was an understanding that these things were against human biology, that this did not work to propagate the human species, and in fact could produce something potentially quite monstrous. So we're talking about that. Let me just see if I can find my reference here. Okay. So just to read this from Sarah Iles Johnston, she talks about Aorai are generally described as ugly. Indeed, the pariemographers tell us that Lamia's ugliness was proverbial. Mormo's name, which means frightful, conveys the same idea. Lamia is portrayed as having disgusting personal habits. Aristophanes describes her as farting in public and having filthy testicles. As noted earlier, scholars cannot agree on the origin of the name Gello, but it seems likely the Greeks would have heard it in allusion to the root words meaning grin and laugh. Actions that distorted the face in a manner perceived as unfeminine and even threatening, as the horrible leer of the Greek Gorgon demonstrates. We also see that facial expression in the Sheila Nagig, and also in the figure of Balbo, who actually makes Demeter laugh. But she has these kind of weird, leering facial expressions. But nonetheless, if you've ever seen anybody make those kind of faces, it is a tad uncanny. Sometimes the Aorai went beyond simple ugliness. Lamia's dirty testicles, obviously, suggest she was far from a normal woman. Nor did she have testicles alone. The 5th century comic poet Crates portrays Lamia as having a staff. Elsewhere in comic theater, scutale is used as slang for phallus. In a passage from Aristophanes that clearly alludes to Crates' earlier description of Lamia, the variant skulaton, that's the word that means staff, seems to be identically used. Some women are busily disguising themselves as men. One woman shows others the splendid skutalon she has stolen from her sleeping husband, and this follows immediately on other women's proud display of their walking sticks. Okay? And you may recall there's a legend from even medieval lore in time of witches stealing the phalluses of men at night and you keeping them as pets. That's an allusion to women who have too many masculine tendencies. In other words, women who are far too independent. Okay, so this is rather interesting. There's also, because some of these, because the origin of the Lamia story is in Libya, there may also be a racist element to it too, because it may be assumed that at least one of the versions of Lamia, or at least the way she's shown, is of course as an African woman. So, so even though it's been said that the Greeks were not racist, they just discriminated against anyone who didn't speak their language in the ancient times. But it's quite possible that they were that there is definitely some racism here, particularly against African women. Then of course they're showing somebody who has belly sagging over their groin, breasts are pendulous, and fang-like teeth. And they said in this particular, there's a particular 5th century Lichthios where she's shown that way, but the coloring they use is that for Libyan people. So that's why I say this. I don't know whether that was really a standard. I don't think necessarily that the Lamia had to be a black woman, but it doesn't. It plays into the idea of those who did not look like the majority or behave in a certain social way as being treated as this kind of outcast and monstrous people. Okay, so just to quote Sarah Iles Johnson again, like her ugliness and filthiness, Lamia's hermaphrodism obviously runs counter to the standard of the desirable woman. But in addition, hermaphrodism made Lamia disconcerting in a way she could never simply be as an ugly woman or ugly man, because she failed to fit neatly into either of the sexual categories. And this has a whole lot of implication, too, for the way that people treat non-binary or transgender people. The idea of there's somehow something wrong with the idea that you are not one sex or the other, or that you're both somehow. Shape-shifting and partial theriomorphism, two other traits through which demons flout categories, are frequently associated with the Aorai as well. Mormo is described by Arina as having a face that changes constantly. All the Aorai were, according to their myths, once women, sometimes are portrayed as having retained human traits. Yet Lamia is also called a beast, Therion. The second part of Mormo's common alternative name, Mormoluke, means she-wolf, and thus implies that she is to be imagined as a werewolf. Theocritus describes Mormo as a horse. Arina's description of Mormo as having big ears and running around on all fours would accord with her portrayal as either a wolf or a horse. Strix frequently is pictured as part woman and part owl or other bird of prey. This is another type of Aorai trait that other Greek Aorai also display. Lamiae are shown as birds in a 5th century CE mosaic, and several Byzantine sources describe Geloods as flying. The Greek association of Aorai with nocturnal birds of prey is hinted at in a myth that goes back at least to the 6th century poetess Corinna. The infanticidal Minyades become a night bird or a bat or an owl or a crow. Okay? So you have this idea of the bird of prey. That may be a reference back to the Babylonian Lamash, too. As we mentioned, is also represented with the bird's feet, or looking like a raptor. The horse is probably a reference back to Poseidon and Poseidon's rather dark sexual escapades, because Poseidon's associated with the horses. We know that he rapes Demeter in the form of a horse, and there's another version of the Medusa story in which he attacks her in the form of a horse. Okay, and of course the let's see. And the Erinyes in this case, she makes reference to the Erinyes, but she's referring to Demeter, the form of Demeter Erinyes, okay, which is the furious form of Demeter as she's searching for Persephone, and she takes the form of a horse. So it says this may be reference to those darker and chthonic elements of them, and of course the idea of the wolf and their cannibalism, as I had mentioned, she discusses here as well. So you have this idea of these women who don't behave or look like women. They either transgress the categories associated with women, or they are both male and female in their attributes, which is really very interesting. Maybe not surprising, in what they tend to represent. So again, it reinforces the idea that women who are not mothers and who don't behave in what they call normal feminine ways or normative feminine ways of having children and getting married and all that fun stuff, are considered to be are equated with these kinds of monstrous women, or have there's the threat of them becoming like these monstrous women. So, for example, if you had a young girl who behaved in a very, in a way that was, very disobedient and perhaps flouting or maybe sexually permissive, she might be seen as, one who might end up being a victim of one of these Aorai, and then may perhaps becoming one herself. Now, there's another association here I wanted to talk about, and that's between the Aorai and goats. And I mention this because we tend to view, we not only we talk about what we think of as quote-unquote base sexuality as relating to goats, i.e., Pan and similar figures, even Dionysus to some degree, as there's some, his connection with the centaurs and the satyrs is also representative of that raw, natural sexuality. Here she says on page 177, many different types of demons in contemporary Greece, including the Lamias, Kamatsorukoi, and Nereides, are frequently described as part goat. Goats are notoriously difficult to manage. For a culture in which herding is important, the goat is a potent symbol of trouble and possible loss of livelihood. This rather broad connotation makes the goat a symbol suitable for a variety of demons. But other symbols expressive of different anxieties are sometimes attached to the same demons as is the goat symbol. So they were talking about an Aradia sometimes having abnormally elongated thighs, which is somehow associated with sexual deviancy. And so it's so she does. I mean, this doesn't necessarily automatically associate that with the Aorai. But we do see this in other types of female demon from that, or what we now would call a demon from that time period. So that association with the goat, as one that is actually almost too free or difficult to rein in. So that's just it. That's sort of a free aspect of the goat. That it's difficult to herd them, difficult to rein them in, and the inability to do so can create trouble. So you see them as it being almost a metaphor for all of this. And of course we know that the Jews would use the scapegoat. The sins of the community would be put on the scapegoat and it would be sent out in exile into the wilderness. And of course there's a whole history that's completely outside of the scope of this podcast and that relationship to what eventually becomes our idea of Satan. But you have this idea of one who is rebellious and one who is free. And this person is seen as a devourer, as a threat to the unit that expands. So it's not surprising, and this is the last thing I want to talk about, is the way that the Aorai are blamed for reproductive failure. Okay. Frequently, I have a note in here about this. Let me find that. Yeah. Okay, she says here, in the course of describing the normative force of the Aorai, I have temporarily left aside the fact that she helped to explain phenomena we would call miscarriage, toxemia, stillbirth, puerperal fever, and sudden infant death syndrome. At first glance, this may not seem to require much investigation. Ghostly explanation for illnesses are often dismissed on the assumption that they arise naturally in societies where medical and scientific knowledge is rudimentary. Yet, in fact, other non-demonic explanations of illness and misfortunes are usually available even in traditional cultures. Illnesses can be blamed on the magical attacks of other mortals, for example, or on a god's anger. In some culture, illnesses are blamed on the moral misconduct of someone close to the victim, each illness being linked to a specific form of misconduct. For the African Lele, the deaths of parturient women and infants are assumed to be due to adulterous behavior within the tribe. Following such a death, the adulterers are sought out and punished. Okay. So we have this idea of them not only being blamed for reproductive failures, but you also have this idea of witchcraft being performed. One prominent example we see of this is Hermione in the play. Oh goodness, why am I not thinking of the name of the play? It's one of the Trojan War plays, and she mentions it here too. So let me just go back. I don't know why my brain is not entirely working today. But it's Andromache. Thank you. I knew it was like the A name. I can't think of it. It was like the time I was teaching a class and I was trying to say Hippolytus and I kept wanting to say Horace. I'm like, no, they're not the same. Okay. Andromache, who was the wife of the Trojan War hero Hector, and Hector, of course, was killed, and she was taken back as a slave and concubine of Apollo's son. And but when he goes away, Hermione, who is the actual wife, hates her because Andromache is actually able to bear children, and she's not, so she accuses Andromache of putting witchcraft on her. Okay, and of course Andromache says, no, it's just because you don't treat your husband the right way. and you're haughty, and you think you're better than he is, and it's a really it's Idomeneus, I think, is the name of Apollo, not Apollo, Achilles' son. I've got all my names mixed up today, but the son of Achilles is Hermione is his wife, and he's given. And Andromache is given to him as a concubine, and she does bear him a son. And when he goes away, Hermione threatens to kill her and her son. So she takes refuge in the Temple of Thetis. So that's the play Andromache. But there, yes, you see Hermione accusing, her trying to justify her actions by accusing her of witchcraft. So even though she's not an Aorai, she's nonetheless, this is a scene, infertility could be seen as an attack from another person. But the Aorai sometimes are also blamed and are considered to be responsible. And you also might think of the idea of changelings that they had. The idea that if you had a child that was very, very sick, that it somehow wasn't your child, that the fairies came and stole your child and replaced it with this malformed or imperfect one in some fashion. And so then people did horrible things to the child to try to make the quote-unquote real child come back. It's not uncommon for this kind of thing to happen. And it goes back to the idea that, or like I said, the displeasure of the gods. Hera did lots of things to lots of women, so she frequently was a force to blame. But the Aorai, these restless dead, the way that they're regarded as these. They're not even regarded as entirely feminine. It's like they're these liminal forces, so they could be male or female, though they started out as female. And they represent this, this lack of motherhood, this lack of doing the womanly duty, this lack of, and then of course, because they haven't, then it's like they try to stop other women from doing it. Socially, you have to talk about what that ends up representing. And even in our society today, which, as I said, is not based on the tribal oikos, but yet still seems to retain a lot of that idea within its structure. I mean, well, you think about it. You think about the way that people try to blame poor morality on the lack of family values. I mean, it's another BS kind of pandering to really this idea that, maybe it made sense at the time. I don't know. I'm not having lived during that time period. I'm not one to really judge how that worked or how people felt about it. But certainly it was as difficult, I'm sure it was as difficult then as it is now for people who stepped outside the norm. And of course, in societies like that, everybody had to come together and, for the benefit of the tribe. It wasn't until you started to have larger cities and diverse populations, when you had people from all over, where the oikos is no longer the central structure, where really the polis, or the city, or the city-state as we think of it, becomes the structure. And again, you have people with different customs and different religions coming from different places. And that brings a different kind of diversity. You don't need the family necessarily to expand, because you're expanding your borders by admitting a diversity of people. But it's funny how, especially people who are very pro-family and anti-immigration, reject the one over the other. They want to go back to the oikos model and reject the polis model. But in the kind of society we live in now, probably something even beyond the polis model is important. But this idea of treating as some kind of a punishment, or as some kind of a curse or a threat, these feminine forces, or these forces that are these shape-shifting forces, that have to do with impulses that we don't, have to do with freedom. Okay. Here's a thought for you. Satanism, of course, is about freedom. Satanism is about rebellion. Now, this is not about Satanism, but the idea is that, you see the roots of these ideas of, these monstrous figures and these cautionary tales about being devoured, or about being dragged away, or becoming a restless dead spirit. come out of the idea of, you violated a social norm. You didn't do what you were expected to do biologically. And so now you've become some other kind of a creature. And similarly, that's the way that we viewed that. I think there's actually a whole collection of essays on Satanism as an act of rebellion. I've seen a few things on it recently. And I'm like, yeah, that's what it is. It's a rebellion against the prevailing religious and cultural order, and saying, it doesn't have to be that way. Not everybody can be shoehorned neatly into that shoe. Excuse me. So, some food for thought there about the idea of these kinds of creatures as representative of, trying to keep people within certain social norms, and whether or not these are relevant, and whether or not these kinds of figures actually have a relevance or a meaning beyond that. I mean, they may represent forces that are scary, but as we've often seen with these feminine forces, they can also sometimes be protective. So, and we have many, many more modern examples of the way in which independent female sexuality can be a problem. One good example, and I know I've brought this up before, is the movie The Exorcist. Okay, now the original Exorcist, there was a boy called, I think they call him Roland Doe, is the name that's been given to him, or at least that was the one. Is supposed to be the original subject of this exorcism. But the movie is about a girl named Reagan and her mother, of course, is what? She's a single mother, she's an actress, she's successful, she's independent. And Reagan is coming into menarche, she's coming into puberty, and she starts fooling around with Ouija boards and stuff. So, in other words, she's kind of interested in quote-unquote witchcraft, which I don't consider interested in Ouija board being an interested in witchcraft, but nonetheless, spiritism, looking at, the other side, crossing the boundary you're not supposed to cross. And what happens to her? She becomes possessed by a demon. Ironically, Pazuzu, who is actually a demon that protects women in childbirth, has the, in fact, exact opposite effect of a Lamashtu or a, type of a creature or a Galu. So it's kind of funny and ironic, but that's the idea of, coming into her sexual own with a mother who's sexually independent. We can't have that. It's going to turn her into a monster. She's going to be preyed upon, and, now she's going to become some other kind of creature. So that may be a more recent example of the kind of thing that we're talking about when we talk about the way in which this monstrous feminine ends up becoming portrayed. And what the problem is really with doing that. It really gets at the heart of, here you are afraid of the dark feminine. What is it you're actually afraid of here? Why, what is the insistence still on maintaining a social and cultural norm and, what was considered to be a biological destiny that no longer is? That's going to be it for now, because I could really talk about this subject for a long time. I want to thank you again for listening. Please visit all my work at Chthonia.net. If you would like to support my work, please visit patreon.com/Chthonia. On social media, I'm Chthonia Podcast. 2 words on Facebook, 1 word on Instagram and Twitter, and just Chthonia on YouTube. And thanks again for listening. Until the next episode. Obviously runs counter to the standard.